Hello and good evening. Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiega, coming to you guys again live today on May the 8th to bring you guys another round of stories around the NFL, starting off with the Cleveland Browns and what their general manager said about Deshaun Watson and his expectations for this coming season, as well as later in the show talking about the Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver Xavier Worthy and what is the one thing everybody is concerned about with him and his career in the NFL. Stick around and listen to all these topics coming up on today's show. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. And without further ado, we will jump into that first segment, the idea of the expectations around the Cleveland Browns and their franchise quarterback, Deshaun Watson, or that is how he was painted out to be a few years ago when he was traded to the Cleveland Browns from the Houston Texans. I talked about it a few days ago, the compensation both of those teams got officially after all these years of figuring out the draft picks, who those draft picks ended up being. It finally concluded after this year's draft. And you look at what the Texans got, they got a boatload of talent and just potential starters on their team from the offensive side of the ball to the defensive side of the ball, talking about Tank Dell, CJ Stroud. They brought in Stephon Diggs. They drafted Will Anderson with one of those picks, Christian Harris as well. They were able to make all of these deals happen because essentially of this trade. And you look on the flip side as to what the Cleveland Browns got as of now. At the time of making this trade, Deshaun Watson and getting that massive deal that the Browns gave him as well, I think it was a bit more of a 50-50, 60-40 sort of trade, depending on which side you favored, and just seeing which side of the equation, the Texans or the Browns, got the better end of the deal. Back then, I think it was a bit closer. Now, before the start of this year, I think you could start leaning towards more the Houston Texans because you've already seen what this has turned out to be. And I talked about in that previous episode the expectations now on Deshaun Watson heading into this year. After 2 full years of being with the Cleveland Browns, he's only managed to play 12 games because during the first season he was serving that suspension. And then this past year, he played a good amount of games, but then he hurt his shoulder and had to have season-ending shoulder surgery because of that. And in his time period being here, in those 12 games, he's only managed to throw for 2,217 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. If you compare that with the 2 years he's been here, you look at it and you say, all right, well, he's been unlucky with injury. He's had to adjust to the team much later than anticipated because of his suspension. But again, you look at that, and that seems like a valid point. I would agree with you there, but you bring in Joe Flacco this season. I know the expectations around Joe Flacco and Deshaun Watson aren't the same because, one, Deshaun Watson is older. He has a lot more legacy to establish in this league after the suspension and the trade and everything like that. Joe Flacco came in, not really much to prove or to try and just play out in his time with the Cleveland Browns. So he comes in, throws 13 touchdowns, no real pressure on him. He's just going out there and playing, has 1,600 yards, and it just seems easy for Joe Flacco. Comparing him to Deshaun Watson, who you paid all this money, there is a bit of a caveat in there with what I just mentioned, the different scenarios each of them are coming from, but it is interesting to look at because of how really seamless it was for Joe Flacco to come in here while Deshaun Watson has continued to struggle in a good amount of these games. But with that all being said, Deshaun Watson remains the unquestioned starter for the Cleveland Browns. The front office, the general manager, even the head coach have all vented their confidence in Deshaun Watson, have really backed him up until this point. Specifically, their general manager, Andrew Berry, said last week that this time period of adjusting, not seeing an ideal situation with Deshaun Watson, he went out and said that they expected this transition period and it's not something uncommon that happens in the NFL. More specifically, he said, we feel good about Deshaun Watson. We like the trajectory we have seen and do think he will have a big year. Last year, he was hindered by that shoulder surgery, like I mentioned. And up until now, he still has been rehabbing. The volunteer workouts have been going on for the last 2 to 3 weeks, I want to say. And we haven't seen Deshaun Watson out there really. He's still rehabbing on that. But even with those doubts and how the rehab hopefully goes as planned, Andrew Berry also continued on to say, we feel very good about the transition. He is in a good spot mentally and physically. We do expect to hit the ground running on that side of the ball, and I know he is very excited about returning to the playing field and getting over this injury. We do have high expectations for him and the offense this season. Again, reestablishing the, I don't want to say pressure, but just the attention to that side of the ball. He said he expects to see the offense hit the ground running, and that up until now, the last 2 years, hasn't been the case with Deshaun. It's been a lot slower transition to get the ball moving. Of course, it helps that you have Nick Chubb, and it is a lot easier for the running game to get going, in my opinion, than the passing game and getting the timing down and everything like that, especially when you bring in Jerry Jeudy and trying to integrate him into the offense. It can get a little bit dicey and a little bit confusing at times, but Andrew Berry, the Cleveland Browns, feel like now in year 3, they expect to get out of the gates firing, come out with a lot more intensity is what I'm picking out from the statements that Andrew Berry made. A lot of high expectations for Deshaun Watson. They were able to reach the playoffs this past season without him, so they have a talented roster. That defense is one of the top defenses in the NFL. On the offensive side of the ball, you didn't have Nick Chubb for the majority of this season because of that injury he sustained against the Pittsburgh Steelers. But when he comes back, I expect him to be Nick Chubb and help this offense as much as he can. So you have a good running game. Their offensive line is solid. You bring in Jerry Jeudy as well to complement Amari Cooper. I thought David Njoku had a mini breakout season last year, becoming one of Joe Flacco's most reliable targets. I think he'll continue that on. Plus a talented defense. It's a great opportunity for Deshaun now to forget about the suspension, the shoulder surgery, and now really almost you peel away all these excuses that you could bring up for Deshaun being here 2 years already. Like, if you haven't gotten used to it by now, when will you? Because of that contract extension, that is one of the biggest points about this whole situation and these expectations. I think these comments aren't just coming out of the blue. I think these are calculated a little bit because of that massive contract that Deshaun got. It is coming to a point where he will be 28 years old, really entering those prosperous years of a quarterback in this sought-out timeline, usually for franchise quarterbacks. It is coming to the point where now you have to at least live up to that contract a little bit. The Cleveland Browns have to see a tad bit more, a glimpse of the potential that they saw in Houston in the third year. They gave you 1 year for the suspension. Last year, unlucky, you got injured. Now, you're probably going to start training camp healthy. You're going to go through everything that every other NFL player goes through. So there's really no excuses, and I think these comments aren't really, like I said before, aren't just coming out of the blue and that they are confident in, but they are adding a bit more emphasis on it this year now that they want to see something, they expect to see something. It's not like they don't feel like Deshaun is capable of doing. They have all the confidence in the world, but with the contract that he got, you have to start thinking about renegotiating it, restructuring it in a way to help you continue to build this roster up, because every year somebody leaves, somebody comes in, somebody gets hurt. No team stays the same that long, honestly, in the NFL. And with so much money being allocated to Deshaun Watson, depending on how this season goes, if it all goes great, how they restructure it, maybe to start thinking about an extension way down the line if he plays great and they're convinced from his level of play, or on the flip side, if it goes bad, how this confidence and how the Cleveland Browns start to talk about him, I think will be interesting to see how it develops. Right now, everything's all dandy and all happy. Everyone's confident in him. But if they continue to struggle, keep an eye on how Kevin Stefanski, Andrew Berry, and these guys talk or answer questions about Deshaun and see how that confidence level kind of wavers in and out if he doesn't live up to these expectations. Right now, everyone's confident in him. I think he could have a bounce-back season. He has the roster to do it. I don't see why he wouldn't be able to. But, again, once you step on that field, once you're out there, it's a whole different ballgame. And I think for Deshaun to do that, he has the capabilities of doing it, but he just has to go out there and prove it once and for all in this massive third year leading in with the Cleveland Browns. But that is that topic. That is a few months away. But in the meantime, we will move on with today's episode. A lot more to cover on today's show. Is Mike Tomlin on the hot seat officially heading into this season? We'll get into that and what one of his former players said on this topic, as well as covering Joe Burrow and his injury update coming back from that wrist injury. He returned to practice this week. I'll give you guys a bit of what he said to the media, as well as what this could mean for the Cincinnati Bengals going forward. All that coming up on today's episode. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.